In the corridors of power across three continents, decisions are being made that few headlines will capture. Yet these choices will reshape the future of 23 million people and reorder the balance of power in the world's most economically vital region. The story playing out right now is not one of sudden crisis or explosive conflict. Instead, it is a calculated game of pressure and patience, where every word carries weight. Every military exercise sends a message, and timing itself has become a weapon. Beijing's leader is pursuing something that sounds almost mundane to the untrained ear. He is requesting that Washington make a formal, public statement. One line, a simple declaration that the United States stands opposed to Taiwan's independence. To outsiders, it may seem like empty diplomacy, a matter of semantics that changes nothing on the ground. But in the world of international relations, where symbolic victories can reshape perception and policy for decades, this request is anything but trivial. It is a masterclass in leverage disguised as negotiation. Meanwhile, Washington appears fractured and uncertain. The incoming administration has made a controversial move, freezing military assistance to Taiwan. We are talking about $400 million in promised equipment. Advanced unmanned aerial systems, precision-guided munitions, and integrated defense networks that Taipei has been counting on for months. The pause is unexplained. The White House offers no clear timeline. Officials speak in vague terms, suggesting that no final decision has been reached, yet the funding remains locked away. For Taiwan, this silence is deafening. At the very same moment, intelligence reports paint a far more ominous picture. Classified documents have surfaced, revealing partnerships being forged in Moscow that directly threaten the island's survival. Russia and China are not simply exchanging pleasantries or signing symbolic trade agreements. They are collaborating on military capability that could fundamentally alter how an invasion of Taiwan might unfold. Chinese military personnel are being trained in Russian airborne tactics. Equipment is being modified and customized. Technical manuals are being transferred. Moscow is establishing permanent training facilities on Chinese soil. This is not theater. This is preparation on an industrial scale. All of these currents are flowing toward a single point on a calendar. 2027. That is the year when, according to Western intelligence agencies, Beijing's military is expected to be fully prepared to launch an invasion of Taiwan. Everything happening now, the aid freezes, the diplomatic pressure, the military drills in the Taiwan Strait, the secret Russian-Chinese partnerships, all of it is moving toward that date. And the question that keeps strategic analysts awake at night is whether Washington even understands what it is up against. The power of language in a digital age, honestly, can't be overstated. Words, phrases, and even the subtlest shifts in tone can ripple across borders, influencing perceptions, shaping policies, and, well, altering the course of international relations. To understand why Beijing's demand for a single sentence of American opposition to Taiwan independence matters so much, we need to look at decades of carefully maintained diplomatic ambiguity. The United States has, for generations, walked an extraordinarily tight rope when it comes to Taiwan. Officially, America recognizes only the People's Republic of China. Yet unofficially, the United States has maintained deep military, economic, and strategic ties with Taiwan. This contradiction exists because it has to. It's really the only way to preserve the status quo while keeping everyone temporarily satisfied. The language Washington has traditionally used is precise. The United States does not support Taiwan's independence. Notice the phrasing. It is passive. It leaves room for interpretation. It does not say America opposes independence. It does not say the U.S. would prevent it. It simply states that Washington does not actively push for it. This ambiguity has been diplomatic genius for half a century. It allows the United States to maintain relations with both Beijing and Taipei. It lets Taiwan believe it has American backing while giving Beijing plausible deniability if it needs to move against the island. Beijing's request would shatter this careful balance. The demand is for the United States to declare that it actively opposes Taiwan's independence. The semantic difference might seem minor to someone unfamiliar with diplomatic language, but in practice, it is enormous. Moving from non-support to active opposition would be a historic concession. It would represent an explicit choice by Washington to close off Taiwan's options. It would signal to the world that the U.S. has effectively abandoned the concept of a self-determined Taiwan, instead siding completely with Beijing's interpretation of events. For Taiwan, such a statement would be psychologically devastating. The island's government and people have long understood that their freedom ultimately depends on international recognition and support. If Washington explicitly opposes their independence, that foundation crumbles. Morale would suffer. Diplomatic outreach efforts would become nearly impossible. Recruitment for the military might decline. Business confidence could shake. Functionally, nothing would change overnight. But strategically, Taiwan would have been diminished without a shot being fired. Beijing understands this power of language better than almost any government on Earth. There is a reason the Communist Party invests so heavily in controlling narratives, shaping discourse, and dominating media spaces. Words matter. Language shapes how people think. How people think shapes what they believe is possible. What they believe is possible determines their actions. This is why Xi Jinping chose his words so carefully when addressing the nation on China's National Day. Standing before the cameras, he declared that Beijing would resolutely oppose separatist movements seeking Taiwan independence and any external interference in Chinese internal affairs. The message was multi-layered. On the surface, it was directed at Taipei, a warning to those who might harbor dreams of formal independence. But the real audience was Washington. By labeling any American military aid to Taiwan, any diplomatic recognition, any security dialogue as interference, Beijing was reframing the entire relationship. No longer would these be normal transactions between trading partners. They would be violations of Chinese sovereignty. They would be provocations. This rhetorical shift is crucial because it sets the stage for Beijing to justify escalation later. What made this year's speech different from previous addresses was the absence of certain language. In the past, especially the year before, Xi had spoken of Taiwan in almost romantic terms, invoking shared history, cultural connections, and bonds of blood. This year, that softer language vanished. It was replaced with sharper, more confrontational terminology. The shift signaled that Beijing was no longer interested in appealing to sentiment or shared heritage. Instead, it was building a legal and rhetorical framework that would justify more aggressive actions if the decision came to implement them. To understand just how dramatic the shift in American support has been, consider the numbers. During the previous administration, Taiwan received over $2 billion in military assistance. In the final months alone, before the transition of power, the U.S. committed over $570 million in additional aid packages. These were substantial commitments meant to ensure that Taiwan had the tools to resist any military pressure from across the strait. Under the new administration, that stream of support has essentially stopped. A package worth $400 million, which had been promised months earlier, now sits in bureaucratic limbo. The stated rationale is that Taiwan is wealthy enough to purchase its own defense systems. The logic offered is that instead of the United States providing aid, Taiwan should be buying equipment directly, as a normal commercial transaction. Superficially, this sounds reasonable. Taiwan does have significant wealth. It does have the financial capacity to acquire weapons. But this argument misses a critical reality. Money can purchase equipment, but it cannot purchase time. Taiwan needs capabilities now, not years from now. When a defense system is purchased through a commercial arrangement, there can be years of delay before it is manufactured, delivered, and integrated into existing forces. When the same system is provided as military aid, often from existing stockpiles, it can arrive in months. That gap between months and years might seem like a minor administrative detail, but when your potential adversary is operating on a deadline just a few years away, that gap becomes a chasm. Taiwan's government understands this constraint all too well. That is why the island's defense officials have committed to dramatically increasing military spending. Next year, defense expenditure will rise to 3.3% of gross domestic product. By the end of this decade, it is planned to reach 5%. For a nation of 23 million people, this represents an enormous commitment of national resources. It means choosing to invest in weapons instead of schools, in military infrastructure instead of healthcare expansions, in defense instead of economic development. It is a choice that will have real consequences for ordinary Taiwanese people for years to come. Yet even this dramatic increase in spending cannot solve the fundamental problem. Building military capacity takes time. Training soldiers, establishing supply chains, integrating new equipment with existing systems. These are not processes that can be rushed. The Taiwanese military is doing everything in its power to accelerate these timelines, but there are physical and logistical limits to how fast you can build an army. China's People's Liberation Army, meanwhile, is not constrained by these same limitations. It is one of the world's largest militaries, backed by an enormous economy and a single-party system that can direct resources with minimal interference. Intelligence assessments from Western governments consistently point to a single timeline. By 2027, the PLA is expected to have achieved sufficient military readiness to launch an invasion of Taiwan. That deadline is not random. It has been discussed in Chinese military circles, referenced in strategic papers, and appears in the calendar of exercises and training programs that China has laid out for the coming years. It is a target date, a moment when Beijing's military is expected to have achieved the capabilities necessary to execute its plans. This creates an extraordinary pressure on Taiwan. The island does not have 3 years to slowly build up its military. Taiwan needs capabilities now to deter Chinese aggression in the near term, while simultaneously building long-term deterrence. Washington's freezing of aid makes this nearly impossible. It is as if a homeowner being targeted by a dangerous criminal is asking for locks on the doors and security systems, only to have a protective agency tell him that the agency cannot help right now, and anyway, he should just buy his own locks. The logic fails when you understand the urgency. Here is where the interpretation of Beijing's leaders becomes crucial to understanding what is really happening. President Trump has reportedly told his advisors that China's leader personally promised him that China would not invade Taiwan during Trump's presidency. To Trump, this is a guarantee, a handshake agreement between two strong men who understand each other, a promise he can point to whenever critics worry about Taiwan. In Trump's mind, he has done what his predecessors could not. He has established such a strong personal relationship with the Chinese leader that Beijing will simply refrain from military action. This interpretation is dangerously naive, not because Trump's counterpart is necessarily lying, but because both sides are interpreting the same words through completely different frameworks. When China's leader says China will not invade Taiwan during the current American presidency, he may genuinely mean it. But that statement is not a promise of restraint born from respect or friendship. It is a statement of timing. It is a recognition that Beijing is not yet ready, and that waiting until after this American presidency ends gives Beijing additional time to prepare. In other words, China gains a window of freedom, a period where Washington is distracted, where the U.S. is focused on trade negotiations and economic deals, where American attention is divided. During this window, Beijing can accelerate its military preparations, strengthen its partnerships with Russia, advance its training programs, and move steadily toward its 2027 deadline. Meanwhile, Washington, believing in the safety guaranteed by a personal promise, may lower its guard and reduce its support for Taiwan. From Beijing's perspective, this is nearly perfect. This is the essence of how Beijing thinks about time and strategy. Chinese strategic culture, shaped by centuries of philosophy and military theory, emphasizes patience and long-term thinking. Western approaches, particularly American ones, tend to focus on immediate results and quarterly metrics. This creates an asymmetry. Washington wants quick wins, immediate trade deals, headlines showing rapid progress. But Beijing is willing to wait years, accepting temporary setbacks in pursuit of long-term advantage. And while Washington waits for visible signs of progress, Beijing quietly advances its position. Military exercises in the Taiwan Strait continue to grow more elaborate and more aggressive. Drills that simulate blockades of the island, exercises that practice missile strikes against coastal targets, training operations that rehearse invasions. These are not small-scale maneuvers. China has conducted military exercises that involved forces greater in size and complexity than many full armies of smaller nations. The scale and frequency of these drills send a clear message to Taiwan. You are surrounded, you are vulnerable, and your adversary is preparing. Simultaneously, China is squeezing Taiwan through other means. Economic levers are being applied, trade routes are being restricted, investment is being redirected. Diplomatic pressure is mounting. Nations that previously had relations with Taiwan are being encouraged to break those ties. Taiwan's space on the world stage is shrinking. This process, which strategists call salami slicing, is gradual and sustained. Each individual action may seem minor, but accumulate dozens of these small pressures, and suddenly you have a very different strategic environment. Taiwan becomes increasingly isolated, increasingly dependent on the United States, and increasingly worried about its future. This psychological dimension is something that Washington sometimes underestimates. Military capability matters, certainly, but so does morale, confidence, and the belief that your country has a future worth defending. If Taiwan's people come to believe that the world is abandoning them, that no one will help them, that their independence is unsustainable, then military capability becomes almost irrelevant. People will not die for a cause they believe is already lost. Taiwan's deterrence depends not just on weapons, but on will. And will depends on believing that help is coming, that sacrifice will be honored, and that the future is worth fighting for. The Moscow-Beijing axis, a new military partnership. Perhaps the most alarming development, and honestly one that has received surprisingly little public attention, involves a partnership between Russia and China that goes far beyond the usual diplomatic cooperation or trade relationships. In mid-2024, a cache of about 800 classified documents was obtained and then verified by the Royal United Services Institute, which is a respected independent research organization based in London. These documents detail a comprehensive military cooperation agreement between Moscow and Beijing. The specifics, frankly, are chilling. Russia has committed to training a full battalion of Chinese paratroopers, bringing elite airborne forces from the People's Liberation Army to Russian military bases for instruction in advanced tactics and techniques. But the training is only part of the arrangement. At the same time, China is purchasing sophisticated Russian military equipment, all of which is being modified to operate with Chinese-designed communications and command systems. The shopping list is, well, pretty revealing. 37 BMD-4M light amphibious vehicles are being acquired. These are airborne assault platforms designed to be dropped from aircraft and deliver soldiers and light weaponry to the battlefield. Additionally, China is buying 11 Sprut SDM-1 self-propelled anti-tank guns and 11 BTR-MDM armored personnel carriers. All of this hardware is being customized with Chinese systems so that it can be seamlessly integrated into Chinese military operations. But there is more. Russia is establishing a permanent repair and maintenance hub on Chinese soil. Moscow is transferring complete technical manuals and documentation to Beijing. This means that China will not merely operate this equipment in the short term. China will eventually be able to manufacture components, perform advanced repairs, and potentially reverse engineer systems to create domestic alternatives. Russia is essentially giving China the tools to build its own version of Russian military technology. In exchange, China is providing Moscow with money and technology lifelines that help keep Russia's military production running, even despite Western sanctions and the enormous costs of the war in Ukraine. The most strategically significant element of this deal involves parachute systems. Russia is providing Dalyot parafoil systems, which are advanced equipment capable of delivering payloads of up to 190 kilograms from altitudes of 32,000 feet. These systems have a glide range of 30 to 80 kilometers, meaning that cargo and troops can be delivered far from the drop zone. Applied to Taiwan, this capability is honestly revolutionary. It means that Chinese forces could airdrop armored vehicles and heavy weapons not onto Taiwan's beaches, where island defenses are concentrated, but onto open terrain deeper inland. Military analysts have pointed out potential landing zones: golf courses, agricultural fields, open areas near ports and airstrips. Basically, anywhere with relatively flat ground and minimal obstacles. Once these locations are secured by airborne forces, follow-on troops and equipment could be landed. A beachhead could be established not through a frontal assault against prepared defenses, but through a backdoor approach using sophisticated airborne insertion. This would fundamentally change how a potential invasion of Taiwan might unfold. The training pipeline is also significant. Chinese officers have already been dispatched to observe Russia's Zapad military exercises. These enormous war games held near NATO's borders that simulate major military operations. The plan is for Chinese paratroopers to receive intensive training at Russian bases. Then, permanent training facilities will be constructed inside China, staffed by Russian military instructors who will transfer knowledge and doctrine to successive generations of Chinese soldiers. What China is acquiring through this partnership is not merely equipment. Equipment, after all, can be purchased from any defense contractor. What China is gaining is battlefield experience and doctrine. Russia has spent the last several years learning brutal lessons in Ukraine. Every mistake made by Russian forces, every successful Ukrainian counterattack, every tactical innovation that emerged in response to new situations, all of this has been captured, analyzed, and incorporated into Russian military doctrine. By training with Russians, by adopting Russian methods, and by absorbing Russian lessons from Ukraine, China is accelerating its own military learning curve. This is enormously valuable. China does not have recent experience in large-scale military operations. The last significant military engagement China participated in was decades ago. By contrast, Russia has been learning and adapting in real time on the battlefield in Ukraine. Some of those lessons are tragic failures that cost thousands of lives. By studying how Russia failed and adapted, China can avoid those mistakes. By adopting tactics that worked for Russia, China can increase the likelihood of success in its own potential operations. The message being sent is clear. China is preparing, not in abstract terms or as a distant possibility, but preparing concretely, operationally, with hardware being delivered, personnel being trained, and doctrine being developed. The 2027 timeline is not theoretical. It is reflected in military budgets, in training schedules, in equipment procurement. Everything is moving toward that date. Ripples across Asia. The credibility question. The implications of all this extend far beyond Taiwan itself. Across Asia, regional powers are watching with growing concern. In Tokyo, Japan's government has announced a record defense budget for 2025, approaching $56 billion. This is the largest military budget in Japan's post-war history. The decision is driven directly by concern that a weakened or fallen Taiwan would leave Japan's southern islands exposed. If China controlled Taiwan, Beijing would have a stepping stone toward the Senkaku Islands, a disputed territory that Japan controls but China claims. The strategic implications are enormous. Japan's move is not isolated. The Philippines, a nation that has historically tried to maintain good relations with China while preserving its American security alliance, has taken a more pronounced step. Manila has reopened military bases to American forces and has allowed increased U.S. military presence on Philippine soil. Yet private conversations with Filipino officials reveal ambivalence. These leaders are asking quietly, if the United States can freeze military aid to Taiwan, if American commitments can be reversed so easily, how reliable is the American security guarantee to the Philippines? If conflict comes, will America actually show up, or will Americans decide to negotiate and cut deals? Australia, typically more assertive in its strategic positioning, is hedging its bets. Canberra is strengthening defense relationships with Japan and India, exploring scenarios where the United States might reduce its strategic commitments in the region. Australian officials are wargaming possibilities where America pulls back, where the regional balance shifts fundamentally, where countries must rely more heavily on their own capabilities and regional partnerships.